Welcome back to Cross to Cross Conversations. I'm Monica. Today is February 6th, 2026. And the question of today is whether or not I am going to address the video that everyone seems to be discussing. And my answer to that question is no, because I don't want to distract from what I'm trying to accomplish in this series. What I will say is that if anyone feels that that video is okay, then you don't understand the plight, and I hope that you are listening to this conversation that I'm having and that you take the time to take in the entire series. Before we begin, I need to give you a very serious content warning. This episode discusses slavery in detail, including violence, sexual assault, family separation, torture, and trauma. I didn't sanitize it, so it is not softened, but it is the truth. So if you have young children listening, you may want to use headphones. If you're a survivor of trauma, please take care of yourself. Pause if you need to, step away if you need to. But if you can stay, I'm asking you to sit with the discomfort. Because our ancestors didn't have the option to just look away. This is what they've lived. So the last episode, we talked about identity and the freedom to be fully ourselves without gatekeeping. In this episode, we're going into the darkness. We're talking about over 200 years of chattel slavery. And we're asking the question, how did anyone survive that? How did they hold on to their humanity when the system was designed to strip it away? And that answer is faith. But not the sanitized Sunday school version of faith, not the accept your suffering and wait for heaven gospel that enslavers tried to force feed them. I'm talking about the kind of faith that sustained people through the Middle Passage. The kind of faith that kept mothers sane when their children were sold away. The kind of faith that allowed people to sing in the fields while their backs bled from the whip. The kind of faith that said, I am human and no one can take that from me. This is faith that sustained us. But before we talk about the faith, we need to talk about what that faith had to endure. So between 1619 and 1808, approximately 12 to 15 million Africans were kidnapped and forcibly transported to the Americas. Approximately 2 million of them died during the voyage. That's the Middle Passage. So let me paint a picture for you of what that was like. So you had Africans that were captured, sometimes in raids, sometimes sold by rival tribes, sometimes kidnapped by European traders. They were chained together and marched to the coast, sometimes hundreds of miles, and many of them died on that march alone. And when they reached the ships, they were packed into the holds, the bottom of the ship, and they were treated like cargo. And I mean that literally. They were treated as cargo and not people. The space was so tight that people couldn't sit up. They were lying down, chained together in rows, hundreds of people crammed into a space designed for maybe dozens. The ceilings were so low you couldn't stand. You could barely move. You're lying there in your own waste and other people's waste, in vomit and blood, the smell unbearable. The heat is suffocating. There's no fresh air. People are dying around you from disease or from dehydration, from despair, and their bodies aren't always removed immediately. The voyage could take weeks or months depending on the route and the weather. Women and children were often kept on deck or in separate quarters, and that wasn't mercy. It was opportunity for sexual violence. Crew members raped women and girls routinely. It was considered one of the perks of working on a slave ship. Some people chose death. They threw themselves overboard if they got the chance, and they starved themselves sometimes. They refused to eat because to them, death was better than this. The ones who survived the Middle Passage arrived in the Americas traumatized, broken, sick. They'd lost everything: their homeland, their families, their freedom, their names. And then the real horror began. So imagine going through the Middle Passage and how horrible that was. Can you even imagine? Can your mind even wrap itself around how it was being so cramped on that ship? Male or female, going through all that you had to go through, only to get to the destination, to get to the Americas. And that's when the real horror begins. When we say chattel slavery, we mean enslaved people were legally considered property. Not people, but property, like a chair, like the one I'm sitting in, or like a horse, like a tool. They had no legal rights. They had no right to marry, no right even to their own children, no right to their own bodies, no right to learn to read or write, no right to gather without permission, no right to defend themselves. They had no rights at all. And let me describe what I believe like a typical day for an enslaved person, how it was like on a plantation. You wake up before sunrise, you're given minimal food, maybe cornmeal, maybe some scraps, but not enough to sustain the labor you're about to do, but enough just to keep you alive. You work from sunrise to sunset in the fields, cotton, tobacco, rice, or sugar, those fields. And the work is backbreaking. You're bent over, you're picking, you're planting, you're harvesting in brutal heat. You have overseers watching you. And if you slow down, you're whipped. If you talk back, you're whipped. And if you look at them wrong, then you're whipped. So the whip wasn't just punishment, it was control, it was terrorism. It was designed to break you physically and psychologically. And I need you to understand, the whip doesn't just hurt in the moment. It leaves scars, permanent scars. So the backs of enslaved people were covered in scars, like layers upon layers of scar tissue from repeated whippings. Some people were whipped so severely they died from infection or blood loss. And I'm sure you've seen some of the backs of people after they've been whipped. You see that you can see the scars. You can see how the scars are just on their backs. It's not a pretty sight. At night, you go back to your quarters, usually a small, poorly built cabin shared with multiple people. You get a few hours of sleep, and then you do it again. You do it day after day, year after year, most times for your entire life. But the physical labor isn't the worst part. The psychological torture is what really breaks people. You know that at any moment, your child could be sold. Your spouse could be sold, your mother, your father, your sibling, all of them could be sold. You might never see them again. Families were routinely separated. Enslavers didn't care. You were property, and property gets sold when it's profitable. Mothers watched their children get dragged away, screaming. Husbands watched their wives sold to other plantations, or children watched their parents disappear, and you couldn't do anything. If you fought back, you were killed. If you ran, you'd be hunted down, tortured, and possibly killed. And if you tried to protect your family, you'd make it worse for them. So you had to endure, you had to watch, you had to survive. And so now we need to talk about the sexual violence because it wasn't occasional, it was systemic. So enslaved women and girls were, and I'm going to be mindful of how often I say the raped word, but that was done to them regularly by their enslavers, overseers, and anyone else with power over them. And there was no recourse, there was no protection, there was no justice. If an enslaved woman became pregnant from that situation, then her child was born into slavery, and the child belonged to the enslaver, not the mother. So after 1808, when the transatlantic slave trade was banned, enslavers couldn't legally import more enslaved people from Africa. So they started breeding them. Yes, you heard me right. Breeding like livestock. Enslaved women were forced to have children to increase the enslavers' stock. Some plantations operated as breeding farms, like places where the primary purpose was producing more enslaved people to sell. Women who had many children were considered valuable. Women who didn't were sometimes sold or punished. Enslaved men were sometimes forced to have children with multiple women to increase reproduction rates. That wasn't love, that wasn't family, that was forced reproduction to create more property. And then those children that were born into slavery, they could be sold away from their mothers at any time. So can you imagine that, especially for those of you that are parents? Imagine women that you give birth, you love the child, and then possibly at age 10 or maybe even age 8, or imagine this, even at age 5, your child is sold, just gone. You'll never see them again. You don't know if they're alive or dead. You don't know if they're being beaten, starved, abused. That's what enslaved mothers lived with every single day. But despite all of this, enslaved people resisted. They ran away. They sabotaged equipment. They worked slowly when they could get away with it. They poisoned enslavers' food. They set fires. They organized rebellions. So I'm sure some of you have heard of the Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831. It terrified white enslavers across the South. Turner, who was a preacher, he believed God called him to lead an uprising. He and his followers killed about 60 white people before the rebellion was crushed. In retaliation, though, white mobs killed over 200 black people, most of whom had nothing to do with the rebellion. Denmark Vesey planned a massive rebellion in Charleston, and that was in 1822. It was betrayed before it could even happen, and Vesey and 34 others were hanged. So they were hanged just because it was planned. They didn't actually carry out the rebellion. And then there's Gabriel Prosser. He planned a rebellion in Virginia in 1800. That rebellion was also betrayed. It was also crushed. So every act of resistance was met with brutal punishment, not just for the person who resisted, but for everyone around them. There were public whippings, mutilations, executions. And some people, in order to survive, and I'm using air quotes here, they chose suicide. It was the only form of control they had left. It was the only way to escape. But most people survived. They endured. They held onto their humanity against all odds. So the question we have to ask is, how did they do that? How did they endure? How do you survive over 200 years of that and not lose your mind? How do you not lose your soul? And based on my research, that answer is faith. So, enslavers knew. So there were two different gospels, if you will. So just stay with me here. There were two different gospels. So enslavers knew that if they controlled what enslaved people believed about God, they could control everything. So they brought in preachers. They were white preachers, often paid by the slaveholders, to preach a very specific gospel to enslaved people. So they preached Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 5. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear. They would preach Colossians 3 and 22. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything. They preached Romans 13. Let everyone be subject to governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. So what was that in translation? Your master has authority over you because God put him there, so don't you resist. So they twisted the story of Ham from Genesis chapter 9 and claimed that black people were cursed by God to be servants forever. They told enslaved people that slavery was God's will, that suffering was part of God's plan, that if they weren't obedient and submissive, they'd be rewarded in heaven. This was the enslaver's gospel. It was a gospel designed to break the spirit while keeping the body in chains. And if you hear today, if you listen to some people, that is why some people actually, they won't consider themselves Christians. They are not believers of the Bible because they say that is the white man's religion. And the reason why they say it's the white man's religion is because they have knowledge of how the gospel was twisted to support slavery. But what the enslavers didn't count on was that enslaved people could think for themselves. Some of them learned to read. Now, although it was considered illegal, they had to do it in secret and with great risk, right? Some of them heard the full Bible being read, not just the cherry-picked verses. And when they encountered the full story of the scripture, they found something completely different. So think about it. They found the God of Exodus. So Exodus chapter 3, verse 7 and 8 reads, "The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them." God sees the misery, God hears the cries, God is concerned about suffering, and God comes down to rescue. This is not the God of the enslaver's gospel. This isn't the God who says, submit to bondage and be content. This is a God who breaks chains, a God who hears the oppressed and moves on their behalf, a God who's actively working for liberation, for freedom. Enslaved people latched onto the Exodus story like a lifeline because it told them that God wasn't neutral about their suffering. God wasn't indifferent. God was on the side of the enslaved, not the enslaver. And that changed everything. When you believe that God sees you, hears you, and is working for your freedom, for your liberation, even when you can't yet see it, you can survive the unsurvivable. And that's for us today, right? Even when we're in the midst of our storms, even when we're in the midst of going through, we call them our wilderness seasons. So even when you can't see the freedom because it's just not there yet, you can survive because you know that God sees you and he hears you and he's working for your good, for your liberation. So now I'm going to move to talk about the spirituals. So there was a little bit of somewhat of theology there, but there was also some resistance, right? That's what the spirituals, I'm specifically referring to what has been commonly called the Negro spirituals. So the spirituals weren't just songs. They were theology and resistance wrapped together. They were coded messages, maps to freedom. So for example, the song that says, "Go Down Moses," and no, I'm not going to sing it for you. I don't have a voice. But the lyrics, some of the lyrics in that song says, "When Israel was in Egypt's land, let my people go. Oppressed so hard they could not stand, let my people go." Egypt was the South. Pharaoh was the enslaver. And Moses was anyone leading them to freedom, including Harriet Tubman. She was actually called Moses because she went back into the South, I believe it was 19 times, to lead people out. So when enslaved people began to sing "Go Down Moses," they were singing about their own liberation. They were praying for deliverance and in some cases signaling that an escape was being planned. The next song, "Wade in the Water." That was an instruction manual. When people were escaping through the Underground Railroad, they were told to walk in rivers and streams so the dogs couldn't track their scent. So they would wade in the water. That was the signal. It was the instruction telling them what to do. The other one, "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot." That talked about a chariot coming to carry someone home. For some, that meant death in heaven. For others, the chariot was the Underground Railroad. Help is coming. Freedom is near. Hold on. So these songs sustained people. They gave them hope. They reminded them that God was still with them, even in the darkness. And it gave them a theology of resistance, a belief that God was calling them to participate in their own liberation. Now, as you know, I'm called to deliverance ministry, and I often teach on transformation, inner healing, and deliverance. And I often tell people that you have to participate in your own freedom, in your own liberation. And this is what our ancestors had to do back in the day. We absolutely are not suffering the same things that they were going through, but we do participate in our own freedom. So let's talk about some of the prophetic voices that was there back in that time. So people who embodied this faith that I'm talking about, that faith that sustained. So let's talk about Harriet Tubman. She escaped slavery back in 1849. She could have stayed free, but she didn't. She went back 19 times and led over 70 people to freedom. She never lost a single passenger, or at least I didn't read that she lost any. She believed God spoke to her through visions and dreams, and she trusted those visions, even when it meant walking into danger. And I read somewhere that she carried a gun, and not primarily to fight enslavers, but to make sure that if someone on her route got scared and wanted to turn back, that they wouldn't endanger everyone else. She'd tell them, "You're free or you're dead, but you're not going back." So that was faith. It was fierce, it was radical, but it was prophetic faith. Let's talk about Frederick Douglass. He escaped slavery and became one of the most powerful voices for abolition. He had a lot to say about American Christianity. In his autobiography, he wrote, "I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slaveholding, woman whipping, cradle plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land." So he didn't reject faith, he rejected the counterfeit version that American slaveholders were peddling. In 1852, Douglass was invited to give a 4th of July speech, and instead of celebrating America's independence, he asked, and this is a famous speech of his, he asked, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July?" I answer, "A day that reveals to him, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty and unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your shouts of liberty and equality hollow mockery." He called out the hypocrisy. He named the sin, and he did it with prophetic clarity. We're going to move on to Sojourner Truth. Born into slavery, escaped, and became a powerful preacher. In 1851, she stood up at a women's rights convention and she said, "Ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children, and seen most of all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman?" And I want to read that again so I can give it some justice. "Ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children, and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman?" She didn't just challenge sexism, she challenged the intersecting oppressions of racism and sexism. And she did it with a voice rooted in faith and lived experience. So, this is I read this and I feel a heaviness, right? I can't imagine. I don't care how much I've studied this and how much I've read this and prepared for this series and read some more. I still cannot imagine all that they've had to go through. I say I have faith. I'm very into my faith walk. I am a teacher of the word. And I don't know if I could say I had that kind of faith that sustained them. And some people wouldn't admit that. They go, oh yeah, I have faith. But as I sit here, even as I'm going over my notes and I'm having this conversation, I can't wrap my head around going through the middle passage, my body not being my own, being sold, being used as someone just to reproduce, only to have those babies taken away from me. I can't even imagine how men were whipped, all that they had to endure, and yet still say they had faith that sustained. Here's what I need you to hear. The same God who heard the cries of enslaved people in the fields hears your cries today. Even though I'm saying I don't know if I have that level of faith. Not that I don't have faith. See, I didn't have to endure what they've endured. I have the faith where I am today. And having just recently come out of a wilderness season of my own, I had the faith to endure that. But do I have the faith or to endure such harsh realities that the enslaved had to endure? So the same God who sustained them through the middle passage, through family separation, through the abuse of what their bodies went through, the torture, the brutality, that same God can sustain you. You come from survivors. You come from people who should not have survived, but they did. People who were told they weren't human and they still held on to their humanity. People who sang in the darkness. People who believed in God who delivers. I'm just thinking about it. Like I said, I feel a heaviness right now. Not a heaviness where I don't believe this. A heaviness where I'm trying to put myself in a place where I can understand what they've gone through, and I can't. And that's a heaviness. I hear the stories, I read the books, every year. Even this is my first time ever actually speaking about Black History Month to the public. And maybe that's why people used to ask me, are you really Black? And so this is the first time I'm doing something like this, doing a series. But what I do every year around Black History Month, during Black History Month, I always take time to read a story, to watch a documentary, maybe to go back to some of my older books that I have on this. And I often ask myself, what more can you learn about your ancestors? See, today, people would like us to say, oh, that's in the past, that doesn't matter. You yourself, Monica, you weren't a slave. No, I wasn't a slave, but I like to have that knowledge. And if I can help somebody understand or give them a piece of information that they didn't know before, then I want to be able to do that. But I want to make sure I'm building my knowledge base as well. But every other year during Black History Month, I'm sitting there and I'm reading in silence or I'm watching the documentary. But as I hear myself having this conversation, I feel it. I feel the heaviness. My throat is getting dry. Yes, some of you may say that's from talking, but it's like I feel sometimes like it's closing in a little bit because I just cannot imagine having to go through something. Such as that. So Psalms 34:18 says that the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and save those who are crushed in spirit. So God is close to you. God hears you, and healing is possible. You carry generational trauma in your DNA. That's real. That's been proven. But you also carry generational faith. You carry generational resilience. You carry the strength of a people who survive the unsurvivable. And that faith, that's your inheritance. So next week, we're talking about hidden figures, the Black inventors and scientists whose brilliance was deliberately erased from history. People who innovated despite the oppression we just talked about. But I needed you to understand the context first. I needed you to know what faith had to sustain people through. Because without that context, you can't fully appreciate the miracle of Black survival, Black excellence, and Black resistance. They survived because they believed, and they resisted because they believed God was on their side. That's the faith that sustained us and is still sustaining us today. This is Monica with Cross to Cross Conversation. Again, the reckoning is here. Talk to you next time.